I want to welcome you this morning to our session on Top 10 Security and Compliance Considerations for Cloud Computing, presented by Carol Woodbury. Whether you're using a cloud-based application or moving your whole infrastructure to the cloud, you should consider how this move affects your organization's security and compliance requirements. In this session, Carol will discuss the top 10 considerations you should make, as well as how to ensure your organization's security and compliance requirements are not compromised. Today's session is sponsored by Skyview Partners, and we're happy to have you all here. Skyview Partners is committed to delivering products and services that not only provide our customers with sound advice, but also saves them time, reduces the cost, and basically simplifies the management of security compliance and the daily security administration tasks necessary for IBMI and AIX. Our presenter this morning is Carol Woodbury, co-founder, president, and CTO of Skyview Partners. Prior to founding Skyview, Carol spent 16-plus years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's iSeries Security Group. And Carol is also the author of the current book, IBM Security Administration and Compliance, available at MC Press Online. You will get that link at the end of the session in that email as well. Available from Skyview Partners are software solutions, including our Skyview Risk Assessor, Vulnerability Assessment, Policy Minder, Security Administration Tool, Audit Journal Reporter, Auditor-Ready Reports, and the new Skyview Policy Minder for IBM AIX. Skyview also provides various services, including security checkups on both IBMI and AIX, managed services for compliance reporting, as well as specific re-architecture and remediation services on a statement of workspaces. With that, I'd like to introduce you to Carol Woodbury, our presenter this morning for Top 10 Security and Compliance Considerations for Cloud Computing. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning, JD. Thanks for that introduction there. All right, we'll get my screen going. All right. Thanks for joining us. The issue of the cloud is getting more and more prevalent, and so I thought it was time to revisit this and talk about some of the laws and regulations that are coming through, as well as some of the additional considerations that you might not have thought of if you did this a few years ago. So you have to wonder if moving things to the cloud, moving your business to the cloud, is just the most wonderful, calm, and it will be paradise for you, or if it's going to be the perfect storm. So hopefully this presentation will present you with some things to consider so that you can have a perfect peace and calm and not be in the middle of this electrical storm. All right, so when considering going to the cloud, most of you all are thinking in terms of the benefits, which is certainly the way to think about this. So the benefits include reduced hardware costs, reduced support of that hardware. If you're not the one managing that hardware, you get to toss that piece of your bill. You often will save some on your software licensing fees as well as maintenance fees. The thing that you have to consider, though, is that there may not be all benefits. You have to make sure that from a security perspective that the cloud provider can meet the requirements of your organization's security policy. And that's really a simple statement to make, but there are a lot of different considerations when thinking through this. And that really is the primary purpose and focus of today's session. There are also legal requirements that you have to consider, as well as compliance requirements. So let's get going. So the number one security consideration for moving information to the cloud is what is at risk. And the answer to that is going to depend on the type of data and what is actually moving to the cloud. And there are so many things that can be moving to the cloud. Your entire data center may be moving to the cloud. We host our systems with IBM in the cloud, so we no longer maintain our own systems. So our our whole infrastructure, if you will, for our IBM I systems is now in a cloud provider. So there's one level of risk there. So you may be doing something like that. You may be moving things like your email servers. Okay, so when you do something like that, you have to start considering your retention processes and your retention period, and does your cloud provider provide those same sort of services. You may be moving a specific application. Maybe you're moving your credit card processing to the cloud. So, or you may be moving things like spreadsheets to the cloud, which contain figures but not really confidential data. So it really depends on the type of data that you're moving and the type of functionality that you're moving to the cloud as to what the actual security risks associated with that are. So you start thinking through that and think through the types of things that you are moving to the cloud. And we'll start to address these as we move through the presentation. Okay, so when we talk about data classification, and I've talked about data classification before, when you classify the data, and when I mean classify, I'm talking about putting a kind of a label on the data like read-only or confidential or private or confidential until announced. That's one that IBM uses a lot, where the information is about new functionality, but once it's released, it's no longer got a label to it. But this data classification is really just some type of label on the data that determines, and based on that label will determine the requirements of how you handle that data from a security perspective. So by that I mean it determines the default access. Okay, so is it read-only? Is it deny by default, meaning nobody gets access unless they're specifically authorized to it? It will define the encryption requirements, retention requirements, storage requirements, disposal method, both online disposal, printed disposal, and so forth. It also has a heavy influence from things like compliance requirements. So if you are storing credit cards or processing credit cards, those compliance requirements will have a heavy influence on the data classification and what those subsequent requirements are. The other thing are legal considerations. So you may have a legal requirement to keep, for example, financial data around for 7 years. So there are several different influencers that come into play when you're talking about data classification. The thing is, yes, you have to classify your data so you know how to handle it. But when you're moving to the cloud, it seems like people just say, oh, it's in the cloud, I don't have to worry about it. But that can't be farther from the truth. In actuality, the data classifications do not change just because the data is now in the cloud. And in fact, there may be other factors that have come into play because you are now in the cloud. So one of the documents that has been issued by NIST, the National Institutes of Standards, is SP 800-144. And so I've just highlighted the top issues that they address in this documentation. And it talks about the need to carefully plan your security and privacy aspects before going to the cloud, before even engaging a cloud provider. So again, planning is really key. You're going to see this throughout this document, that the key to a successful move and security and privacy requirements upheld in the cloud is really due to successful planning. The other thing is that you need to understand the environment, their computing environment, before you move to that cloud provider, before you consider it. There are things called public cloud providers. One of those is probably the best known is probably Google with their Google Docs, and that's what we call a public cloud provider. I referenced IBM I in the cloud. That is a private cloud provider. Okay, so there's a very focused group that provides IBM I in the cloud. That is a different environment, a vastly different environment than Google, for example, which is what you see is what you get. They're not going to change for your requirements. So that's why you have to understand the computing environment of the provider before you engage with them. Then you have to make sure that that cloud computing solution satisfies all of your security and privacy requirements. So if you're doing something like going to Google Mail, or maybe you're going to the Microsoft Outlook 360, whatever solution you're going to, you have to understand whether their solution will satisfy your internal requirements, because again, just because it goes into the cloud does not absolve you of that responsibility. It's not, there's joint responsibility between the cloud provider and you to make sure that data remains secure and private. So then you also have to make sure that the client-side computing environment meets your requirements. And lastly, it talks about maintaining accountability over the cloud provider's environment. And again, just because it moves to the cloud doesn't mean you can wash your hands and say, I don't have any responsibility any longer. That's not true. You have to maintain a constant state of accountability and holding them accountable to the things that you agreed to. So let's talk about that even more. The key to a success is really to gather your organization's requirements and then agree to the terms and conditions prior to moving to the cloud. So just because it looks like it's going to save you money to move your email to the cloud, you again have to start thinking about what are your requirements. So I alluded to it earlier. A lot of people are moving their email solutions to the cloud. But one of the things you have to consider is your retention period for your email. So if you have a retention period that says you're not going to keep email any longer than a year, you have to make sure that that cloud provider can either purge those records for you or provide a method for you to do that. And if they can't, then that is an example of something that will violate your security policy and your requirements. So that's just one very simple example of needing to get that done before you move to the cloud. Now, some of the other compliance requirements that come into play are things like encryption. So there are all sorts of state regulations and national requirements, both in the United States, Canada, Europe, that require certain things be encrypted. It may be the communication between you and the cloud provider. It may be the information stored in the cloud has to be encrypted, but there are all manner of encryption requirements. So you can't just assume that they can provide those types of encryption considerations. You have to make sure that you have outlined every place that encryption is important to you and is a requirement for you. The other thing is logging. A lot of regulations, again, require certain kinds of logging. HIPAA does that. The PCI requirements have several requirements for logging or auditing. So you have to think through whether and find out whether or not that cloud provider can do sufficient logging. One example is the PCI requirement that says all administrators' activities has to be logged. So you think, well, that's fine. I'm going to be working in the cloud. I don't need to log those activities anymore because I'm no longer the administrator of the system. I'm just using the application. So that requirement goes away. But it doesn't. It doesn't go away because there is someone that is actually administering the system. And so you have to make sure that that provider's practice is to make sure that all of their administrators' actions are logged. So again, just moving into the cloud may not require your actions to be audited, but somebody really is still administering that system, and so theirs has to be audited or logged. Another piece of information that has to be considered are passwords, and not just password in clear text. So again, that's a PCI requirement, that there are no passwords that flow in the clear throughout the network. So when you think about signing on to Google Docs, is that a secure connection or not? So that's one place that you'd want to look at that. The other thing is just the practice of changing passwords. Are they able to apply the same password composition rules and the password change frequency that you currently have required? Another one is access controls. How do they manage the access controls into the application or to the systems? Reporting. You may have internal audit, or you may have external auditors that require some type of audit reports to go on. Can your cloud provider still provide means for you to get the types of auditing and reporting for those auditors? And finally, what's their incident response handling? And again, this is something that is required in both PCI and HIPAA, that you have an incident response team. So by that, I mean, if there is a breach, is the cloud provider able to handle the necessary focus and the necessary investigation that will have to occur to find out why that breach actually occurred, and to cooperate with whoever is doing the actual investigation to provide the information for them and provide it on a timely basis. The last group that I would check with from a compliance perspective is your QSA, if you are doing PCI work, or your auditor, internal and external, to see what their concerns are, again, before you go to the cloud. It would really be pretty tragic if you've spent the energy and the time and the money to move something to the cloud and then have your auditor come back and say, nope, that doesn't work for me. So engage them prior to moving to the cloud to find out what their requirements and their considerations are before you move. And if you haven't gotten a wind of this yet, again, that upfront planning, that's key to successfully moving to the cloud. I'll keep emphasizing that. Now, number 6 in the security concerns for moving to the cloud are legal requirements. And you might think, legal requirements? Why would I have legal requirements that I have to think about? Well, it's really interesting. Some in the United States, but mainly on a state level. So if you think about some of the laws that have been put in for breach notification, there's a law out of Massachusetts that says that any information that is downloaded, like from a database that contains personally identifiable information, has to be encrypted. So there's state-by-state laws that you have to consider as to whether they're going to come into play. And then if you are an international company, or if you're listening in from the EU, there are all manner of location requirements from a EU data directive perspective. So in the EU, there are certain countries where your data cannot reside. I've actually heard of some people not being able to go to the cloud because the data center was actually going to be in another country, and their home country didn't allow their data to be stored in that other country. Or the other thing is that you might not know where that data is. So one of the benefits of moving to the cloud is that your data is perpetually available, and one of the ways that they do that is that they replicate your data, could be literally around the world. And so you may not be able to know where your data is physically located, and it's probably located in more than one place. So you have to consider that type of legal requirement. The other thing about where the data is physically located, and because it's replicated so many places, if you need that data to be deleted, or if you are deleting records, like cleaning up old records, or again, maybe your retention policy kicks in and says, we don't keep credit card transactions older than a year, something like that, you want to make sure that that data is deleted. And but how can you make sure that that data is deleted if it's replicated around the world? So again, you have to understand how your cloud provider works, where they are physically located, where their data centers are physically located, and determine if that's going to be a problem for you. Again, I go back to the email, and one of the reasons I'm focused on email is because in the litigation process, you have to think about the discovery process. And I'm sure you've all heard in the news, somebody goes back and looks through email and they've discovered that somebody said something to somebody else or implicated someone or gave trade secrets to someone. So a lot of environments have instituted an email retention policy. So again, if you're moving your information to the cloud, you have to make sure that that information has actually been deleted, and deleted from all copies have been deleted. Again, from a legal requirements point of view, you also need to look at the incident response handling. One of the things you'll want to agree upon before you sign the contract is what is the definition of a breach, because if you talk to 5 people, there will probably be likely at least 3 definitions, if not 5 definitions of a breach. So you have to make sure that you all agree to what a breach constitutes and what the expected actions are as a result of a breach. And there may be several different kinds of breaches and demanding different types of responses. So then the other thing is you may have service level agreements for your customers, certain uptimes that you have to provide for your customers. So if you are moving, for example, your data center to the cloud and your customers are saying that, or you have an SLA saying that your customers will be online or downtime will last no more than 30 minutes or something like that, can that cloud provider continue to provide that type of service so your SLAs can be fulfilled? And the other one is when you're thinking about this, think disaster recovery, right? Can they aid in the disaster recovery and again provide for those SLAs? The other thing is that you have to plan for outages. This is not a bullet on this slide, but plan for outages. Recently, Google was having some problems. They had downtime that affected all of their Google Mail providers, and they were down for an hour, at least 2 days. So what happens if you are an organization whose email has been moved to the cloud and you can't get that email for an hour? An hour is probably not bad, but what if you are Netflix and you are depending on people being able to download movies and stream video and so forth, and the outage lasts several days? So you have to think about disaster recovery, and if your cloud provider service does actually go down, what are your contingency plans? So the next thing that you need to talk to about with your cloud provider is their security practices. So again, you have a best practice that says I'm only going to give superpower, meaning all object on IBM I or root on AIX. You are only going to give those people that power to limited people. What is the cloud provider's security practice for something like that? Again, then once they have admin rights, who and what activity is being logged? I talked about that a little bit earlier. Things like, do administrators access the system via encrypted sessions? If that's a requirement for you, you need to make sure that they enforce that on their side. What is their patch management strategy? Again, does that provide the protection that you need from a patch strategy? So if you're doing things with Windows servers, do they look at Patch Tuesday and patch immediately? What is their patching strategy? In the IBM I world, that would be, what is their PTF strategy? The other thing is what antivirus, anti-malware software is used on their routers, on their desktops that are accessing your systems and so forth. And again, you'll want to make sure to find out how often those things are updated for them. Then, are their servers in compliance with, name your alphabet of law or regulation, PCI, SOX, HIPAA, PIPEDA, the EU Data Protection Directive, and so forth. And who is the cloud provider audited by, and can you see the results of that last audit? So there are audits specifically designed for cloud providers, and you will want to make sure that you get their latest review, make sure they are audited for one thing, and get the latest from that. Another thing to consider is account management. So you have users that you're creating in your systems, and you often have a policy that says that users are going to be removed from accessing your network and accessing your applications within hours or 24 hours, especially if that person has been dismissed from the company. So whatever application you're thinking of moving to the cloud, whether it's your whole infrastructure or just an application or two, is the cloud provider able to provide the type of response time that you need to cut off their access? So it used to be that if somebody was dismissed from the company, you really just had to make sure that they didn't have physical access to the building. So that was easy. You just made sure their badge didn't work, basically. Then the days of being able to VPN into your corporate network came along. And again, that was pretty easy to control because you could just cut off their VPN access and disallow access that way. But now think of applications such as Salesforce.com or some other application that is totally cloud-based. You have to remember to cut off their access to that as well as things like Google Docs and so forth. So it's not just as easy to make sure that that access has been removed in a timely basis. So you have to think through all of that, and you have to make sure that that cloud provider can provide that time of timely account management for you. Again, we've talked about logging, so things like logging invalid sign-on attempts and a lockout for that, or do they just perpetually try to allow somebody to get into Salesforce.com on your behalf? And so then there's other things like retention of logs, the review of the logs, and so forth. Okay. The last bullet is talking about network logging. Now, an interesting thing that a lot of people have started to implement is something called DLP, data loss prevention. And data loss prevention is really about detecting inappropriate movement of data through the network. So if you have implemented DLP in your environment and now suddenly part of your environment is going to be moved to the cloud, how does that affect your ability to detect inappropriate movement? So just an example of what DLP will do. A lot of people have implemented DLP, and in DLP they scan email, and they're scanning email for credit card numbers. Maybe they'll allow one or two, but anything over that, the administrator will get a notice of it. Or maybe they're scanning attachments for different types of corporate data and that type of thing. So again, it's about detecting the movement of critical information and making sure it's flowing through the network appropriately and not perhaps to a memory stick or being FTP'd or something like that. So again, if you have implemented DLP, you have to make sure that that sort of thing still is available in the cloud if that's part of your security requirements. Now, one of the things to be aware of and just think through before you move to the cloud is that because the service provider holds so much data, they may become a victim of a targeted attack. So lately we've seen a lot of distributed denial of service attacks, and this is where many sources are trying to bombard basically a location, and recently it's been banks, so that their network is not available. So denial of service is really meaning that they are doing something to the network or to the system that makes it not available to somebody else. So because your cloud provider typically holds so much data, they may very well be a target of attack, either for denial of service or to get at the data. Now the good news is that because they hold so much data, they typically have the network monitoring in place to be able to detect and respond to an attack. They typically have the trained personnel, probably that you wouldn't be able to hire, but because of the business that they're in, they have been able to hire the right people to, again, be able to recognize and respond to the attack and stay up on the latest threats. And they also have the latest hardware to be able to respond to it. So just understand that that is a possibility, but on the flip side, they may be able to respond to a situation like that better than you would be able to. So again, I've talked a lot about making sure that you are talking to the cloud provider before you do the contract. So things that you will want to look at for the service level agreement with the cloud provider include what your business level objectives are, the responsibility of both parties, make sure that both parties understand the business continuity and disaster recovery planning situations, redundancy, where all is that data going, the maintenance requirements, the data location requirements, data seizure. Now this is an interesting one. What happens if the cloud provider comes under some type of litigation and the data is seized? Is your data seized? Is all the data that that cloud provider provides seized? Is if somebody else, some other organization that cloud provider hosts, if they're under litigation and your data is commingled on a server with that other organization, is your data going to be seized in that type of situation? You have to think through all of those legal requirements in that type of scenario for data seizure. The other one to consider is what happens if your data cloud provider fails. They actually, excuse me, sorry about that. What happens if the cloud provider actually fails, so they go out of business? What happens to your data? What happens to your hardware? If you've literally moved hardware to the location. So you have to think through that. You will also want to consider the jurisdiction if you have to bring legal action against them, and whatever brokers or resellers they're using. There's some really interesting information. IBM has done some really good, and if you're paying any attention to their marketing right now, they're all about the cloud, but they've done some really good information on working with cloud providers, and this is where these headlines come from. So this is the URL for that white paper. The handouts will be available for this, so you don't have to try to scribble this down right now. So again, more requirements that feed into the SLA, things like your security requirements, encryption, privacy. Now, an interesting thing with privacy, and we haven't really talked about that yet, is that there's pending legislation that has gone through the EU. It's already out for comment, and there's several laws and regulations trying to go through the United States Congress right now. But there's one very specific one in California that, in all three of these situations, the laws are specifically addressing the privacy of data. So an interesting thing is that if you look at the data that is collected in the cloud, and I'm talking mainly about social engineering here, but you may have an application, not social engineering, the social networks that are out there. So you may have an application that retains data, all right? And you may look at that data from many different angles, and you may aggregate that data that has been collected from your application or website with other data and to spot trends. And if you, again, follow the industry, This is part of what big data is all about. You get all the social network information, and it's aggregated over several different types of websites and social media input, and they're using it to spot trends. Well, there is legislation going through all over that is requiring companies that collect data to allow the person giving that data to regulate how long and what data is being retained. So again, you have to really be careful about what your cloud provider is doing on the privacy front. Are they aware of these laws and regulations that are going in? Because if the cloud provider, again, is something like an application, like Salesforce.com, something like that, if they are the ones that are collecting the data, you want to make sure that your employees' rights are going to be protected by using that application. So Salesforce.com is going to have to comply with those laws and regulations when they come out. So privacy is a really interesting one to watch in the days going forward. Bottom line, and again, if you haven't caught wind of this yet, you went out for too many cups of coffee. Determine your organization's security and compliance requirements before you go to the cloud. Determine it before you go to the cloud, or you could certainly be sorely surprised. You have to define the SLAs that must be in place. The terminology and the communication of that terminology is key, because you, again, have to make sure that everybody agrees to the definitions of each one of these terms. So make sure that you agree to the service level objectives and do it in such a way that you can monitor it. If you put a service level agreement in place that can't be measured, it's going to be really hard to know if they are meeting it or not. So make sure that you put it in terms where that service can be monitored. Again, terms and conditions are key to ensuring that your requirements are met. Now, and then another interesting one, and number 10, is that before you move to the cloud, find your private and confidential data. Just because it shouldn't exist on Windows servers doesn't mean it doesn't exist there. So for example, maybe you are outsourcing some of your Windows applications. Maybe you are going to some sort of file share in the cloud, file sharing application in the cloud. Great. So what you're going to do is take all your servers and just upload the contents into the cloud, and you're done. And you may think that you're not moving confidential data or private data or healthcare data or credit card information, but you can't assume that, because I can't tell you the number of times where companies have come to us, we're working on a PCI project, and they realize that in looking for their data on the IBM I, they see that a process is downloading into some spreadsheet, and when they go and they check with that user, oh yeah, that user has been sharing that on a SharePoint for years. So there's all manner of confidential data out on their Windows servers. So again, just make sure that anything that you move to the cloud, you know exactly what you are moving, exactly the type of data, and that there are no surprises. And the reason that's important is because, yes, you were you may not have been in compliance within your own network, but now that you're moving that out to the cloud, if you think that you're not moving confidential information or private information to the cloud, you're going to put fewer security requirements on that cloud provider. So it's now, the data is now in the cloud. Who knows who can get at that if you have not put on strong requirements on that cloud provider. So you want to make sure that no confidential or private data moves to the cloud unless you are specifically meaning to move it to the cloud. And that kind of comes to the topic of private clouds. So just because you have private data doesn't mean you can't move to the cloud, but if you are doing that, you are probably more than likely moving to something called a private cloud. And that's where cloud providers have specific purposes for the type of data that you're trying to move. So you may assume that if you have healthcare information you can't go to the cloud, but that's not true. There are actually cloud providers that specialize in the healthcare type of data. Now, that is going to cost you significantly more than just opening up a Google Doc and throwing your data out there. But the point with that is that you are going to actually get the type of information and security practices that you need. So that was the specialized clouds. Sorry. Private clouds. Okay, let's talk about private clouds. So the specialized clouds typically specialize in a specific type of solution, HIPAA, PCI, and so forth. You may also have a specific application, like a J.D. Edwards application, Infinium, and so forth, and there are cloud providers for that. Private clouds, however, are when an organization has decided to consolidate their data centers into one data center. And so rather than moving it into the public cloud, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, they are moving it into a private cloud, which is basically a consolidated data center. So again, you can reduce your hardware and software costs. You can get quicker patching typically because you have fewer footprint. You again have the ability to have the personnel in a monitoring NOC so that you can have the recognition of an attack and instant response and just the overall general security knowledge of protecting that data and that network. You can get consolidated logging, correlation of events, which is really beneficial, and typically more layers of security. And again, it's much more easily defined and the requirements are much more easily met in a private cloud, one place in your organization, than to have your data be scattered about 10 different data centers. So many organizations are going to a private cloud. And we've talked about specialized clouds. And then we have a number of service providers in the IBM I world that have been around for a very long time. And so we've always called them service providers. But in reality, they're cloud service providers. So, it's the same sort of thing, just a different term. But the security and compliance and the legal requirements that I've been talking about for cloud providers are the same that you should levy on your service providers. There's nothing different about it. We're just calling them something different. Or we're used to calling them something different, I should say. So there are a number of resources available to find out more information about cloud security. Right in the Seattle area, I'm really privileged to have something right in my own backyard called the Cloud Security Alliance Organization. And so they have a website, and their goal is to become the PCI Council only for cloud computing. So their goal is to set out standards and requirements for secure computing in the cloud. Then there's been a number of publications out by NIST, and there's some draft documentations as well. And PCI has recognized that people are moving some parts of their network and as well as credit card processing and that sort of thing to the cloud. And so they have put out a very specific paper addressing that issue, and it was publicized by the Cloud Special Interest Group. So I've listed the documentation for that as well. There's also articles out on the SANS.org website. They are an education website for security matters. ISACA is a place that you work through for certain certifications. That's where my certification comes from. And then if you're interested in looking at requirements across Europe, all I had to do was type in European Cloud Computing Strategy into Google, and I came up with all manner of links. And that's probably the easiest place to watch for the updates to the EU Data Protection Directive that should be coming out within the next few months, actually, in final draft form. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you for listening today. And if you need any more information, you please feel free to contact Skyview Partners at the addresses that I've listed below. JD?